John, thank you so much for making the time for us. You played an instrumental role in the birth of the environmental movement from the early 1960s. Your book, Future Environments of North America, was the first to use the word environment to describe a cultural paradigm shift into a responsible ecological view of our oneness with Earth. And a little later in the early 70s, you were the first ecologist on staff at the White House, right? At a pivotal time. We all know back then the EPA was created. And back then, kind of with your involvement, we really saw the creation of the legal basis of the environmental movement. And then later, you turned, or shortly after, your main attention kind of once that legal basis for the environmental movement was in place, you turned your attention on creating the spiritual basis for the environmental movement. And so I wonder now, 50 years on, 50, 60 plus years on, how do you look back at the current moment? And what was it back then? I think must have been somewhere in the 70s that prompted you to move on from the legal basis for the environmental movement to the spiritual basis. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Otto. I should mention that I did begin doing a deep retreat in nature, a vision quest type of retreat, generally sort of a Native American style, because my family were strongly influenced by Native American culture, and we even used an agricultural system based on Native American practices. So I did my first vision quest at age 7. And then after that, began doing it at least once a year, sometimes 2 or 3 times. And that was, so from 7 right on through my teens, I was doing very deep spiritual cultivation, utilizing initially the vision quest process, and then beginning to train in those cultural systems that I felt had a strong nature connectivity to them. And that was especially in things like Zen Buddhism, Taoism, mystical Christianity, and then many of the indigenous cultures. My first human teacher was a shaman from the Mayan culture in Yucatan.
Hmm. When was that? What was your age back then when you met?
I must have been about 18 or 19, and I lived with him for a year in the rainforest. And it was an amazing experience for a young kid. But so I should clarify that I did have a little bit of that other current flowing through my life right from the start. And I remember I asked it's kind of funny, I asked my parents and grandparents, I wanted to have permission to go out and do this solo in nature. And of course, that was a little strange in those days. And so they said, well, maybe next year. I think I started asking around 4 or 5. And so they put me off year by year until finally I reached age 7. And then they said, okay, grandson, you're ready. So we'll put you out. And then I had a short immersion of 4 or 5 nights and days.
Wow.
Went very deep. And that experience bonded me so deeply with the trees, with the flowers, with the animals, with the plants, with the elements of nature, that I came out having been through kind of almost like a second birth out of the body, out of the womb of nature herself, into life. And it affected my entire life from that point on. And that in many ways was the motivating experience that led me to decide to study the science of ecology. In those days, back in the 50s, when I began doing that, when people asked me what I was studying, I said ecosystem ecology, and I got a blank stare. And people thought it was maybe like entomology, the study of bugs, or they couldn't reference it. The word was not in use, and or not very widely. So, but that really inspired me to go into ecology because there's the science of natural systems. Here's how nature arises as an interconnected whole. And also, here is how we can begin to view nature, not just as something we take from as a resource, but as something that we participate in as a partner, as a co-equal partner, like a member of a family. And so it became an important foundation for my work. And then that led to, quite naturally, to how do we get this out and about into broad human culture? And I was very inspired by Rachel Carson, who wrote a book called Silent Spring. And there's another book that Fairfield Osborne wrote in 1948 called Our Plundered Planet. And then after that came a book called Man's Fate in Changing the Face of the Earth. Those three books really made me realize that we really needed to create some kind of bigger understanding of the whole system, which ecology had helped refine, and where the Vision Quest experience, I mean, I was the entire system. So we had the experiential foundation with the Vision Quest process, and then the scientific foundation with the study of ecology and ecosystems. And I specialized in tropical ecology and Arctic ecology to see the contrast between the two types of systems. But out of that, I looked for a word that might describe in popular culture a whole system perspective, where we're part of that system, not just a taker coming in and using it as a resource. And environment seemed to be a good candidate. And by that time, I was working with the Conservation Foundation, which later was absorbed by the World Wildlife Fund. And I ended up directing their international programs for a while. But one of the very first projects I did there was to put together a gathering of leaders from many different backgrounds, regional planning, economics, biology, and so on. And each of them were leaders in those fields. We brought them together to address these whole system issues, which were beginning to emerge, that Rachel Carson so beautifully talked about, and also Fairfield Osborne in Our Plundered Planet. And then we had each individual had a day to present how their discipline and their background and their approach would solve these whole system issues. At the end of the week of sharing these different approaches, and they were pre-prepared, so people had plenty of time to really think it through. We came together, and people, each one of those systems that were taking parts of the environment or parts of nature and taking responsibility for it, trying to come up with a healthier, more sustainable, and ecologically balanced approach. It wasn't happening through any particular one discipline. So we came together at the end and realized that we needed to really have a word around which we could all gather, and the disciplines could bring their skills to bear, but from an interconnected whole, where all the systems came together. So the word we chose was environment, which is a word, of course, in proper usage, but it was not precisely used in the way to describe that whole system partnership of humans and nature working together as a big family. And fortunately, that conference, because it had so many leaders from all over the world, it was able to kind of really give that word quite a big boost into the culture. And suddenly it began showing up in universities and different public policy situations and contexts. And I think we had the big gathering where we brought all these leaders together in 1965. And then we had a book published, edited a book that took all the proceedings that together. And the combination of all that led to a pretty massive wave of the usage of that word to describe the whole system or perspective. And of course, by the late 60s, the environmental movement really caught fire and spread around the world. And I'd like to think that word played a small catalytic role in helping that to happen. And I have to really credit, frankly, the going deep into nature with the help of my parents and grandparents in my early days is really the inspiration to get that going.
Mm.
So it's very interwoven with the spiritual side.
Mm. Wow, thank you for sharing that, and for sharing how what you do, what you have led thousands of people, including myself, right, through, which is a sacred journey with nature as a teacher, right, and how to progress on that journey, how that is really embodied in your own life, right? You as a 5-year-old demanding that, and then starting as a 7-year-old beginning to practice that, going to university, seeing all the language of interdependence, but also missing some other dimensions, right? And then creating a social field, right, with all these different scientists and pioneers of that movement that wasn't even a movement back then, where through that social process, maybe kind of that spark or that potential kind of for catalyzing this bigger global movement, which then I experienced later. So where that happened and where that got sparked. So I received in my own life the tail end of that, right? So in the environmental movement was a massive movement in the late 70s when I was a teenager. And so it mobilized everyone. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, in my generation, right? Everyone I was connected with, at least, right? So there's it is always interesting to look back at the beginnings, and yet much of that kind of what we saw back then and what I experienced there also was the outer dimension of that movement, right? So that, so in my case, it was kind of the anti-nuclear power plant, anti-nuke movement, and so on and so forth. So back to the question, yes, the interior dimension was already built into your childhood experience, but how then? What is your own account when you look from today's perspective, where a lot more people are actually looking for a deeper? Everyone feels like just the outer environmental things, that's not enough. We need to somehow develop the resonance, develop the language, develop the and cultivate the interior connection, that spiritual path to Gaia, kind of to Mother Earth. How is it that that movement, the second part of that movement, that was maybe incipient back then, how that happened from your own perspective? Because over the past decades, you have been teaching this path for nature as a teacher, and for this sacred awareness for so many years. So what is your own account on that? So how do you see that becoming part of the first part of the environmental movement?
Well, I should mention that I got very involved with public policy, as well as helping get the term environment going. And so I was very much involved with helping things like the Environmental Policy Act. In particular, that was one of the first things that I and a fellow named Sam Ordway and one other fellow published some early articles on the need for some kind of entity that could take into account the impact of federally supported programs and processes, and do a review of the impact of those projects, so that we could know what was going on and look into the ecological and social and economic impacts after the project was done. So I got very involved with helping the Environmental Policy Act. In part, that came out of that conference, an early book I mentioned. And we did another project, which I ran between I guess that would have been 1967 through about 10 years, starting in 1967. And this was looking into doing Harvard cell case studies of the major development types of projects all over the planet. So we produced, using an Harvard case study approach, 200 case studies of the actual impact of humans on the planet, and
Hmm.
with very good evidence of exactly how the impacts were hitting ecologically, socially, and economically.
Hmm.
And then by the time we compiled all that, we brought it together into a gathering again. I think we held it in '68. And we looked into and that was a gathering that looked into these massive impacts. And the case studies showed were case studies of what happened after the project, 5, 10, 15, or 20 years later. And nothing was being done to do that kind of environmental review. So obviously, there was a need to have a legislative process that could take that on and do it. And the Environmental Policy Act established the Council on Environmental Quality came into being under the administration, but then the EPA was formed, and that had the responsibility to carry on that process of assessing impacts. And then that idea began to spread around the planet. And I should say that this database of these 200 case studies then became a database for the United Nations Conference on the Environment, the first one that was ever held by the UN in Stockholm in 1972. So that body of scientific evidence then became a basis for that gathering. And that really got the environmental movement going globally, and the policy making and legal aspect established as a global process. I noticed, as many of my associates who were becoming involved in the environmental movement, many of the leaders were burning out,
Hmm.
and they were getting very discouraged. They felt that it was not working. They were not making any headway. So I said, well, why don't you come out to I had a little farm in West Virginia.
Hmm.
So I said, why don't you come on out and spend a few days? I can put you out in the woods. You can camp for a little while. You can connect to nature. I've been doing this all my life. Why don't you give it a try? It might be helpful to you. And so I began taking various leaders and individuals out who were burning out.
Hmm.
And what happened was I noticed when they came back in, they were re-inspired, reconnected, and suddenly that well of inspiration and creativity began to rise from deep within. And so they made a connection to source, basically. And they connected with outer nature, inner nature, and what I came later to call true nature. So out of that experience, I began to, in addition to my legislative work, I thought I would start investigating other cultural systems that were nature connective. And I came up with things like, of course, the Native American, very nature connected process. Taoism, very nature connective. Non-dual Advaita Vedanta has a strong foundation as the forest dwellers in ancient India, very nature connected in its origins. And so I began to study in those different traditions, went to those parts of the world, and I studied deeply with the best teachers I could find. And then I began to find the common ground principles of those traditions. And I distilled that common ground material into a series of processes and practices that I brought together in something I called the way of nature, which was a common ground aspect where it was not the property of any particular culture. It was really where they all came together and what they had in common. And I found that when I provided that material, the training processes and the principles and the practices, and they went out into nature with that material, then they could go very, very deep when they dropped into that connection with outer, inner, and true nature. They could really take a deep dive into the essence of themselves. And many of those traditions also opened up true nature or the pure source aspect. So it provided a way of going very, very deep over time. And then, of course, they came out and began to integrate that material and figure out how to take the creativity that arose from the experience of the awareness training and the deep solo, going deep into that in nature, how they could integrate that into their life. And that translated into improving the legislative activities, improving the policy making work, and restoring their spiritual connection to nature, which is the source of really the inspiration that got them to get involved in the first place. So And then I noticed that, I was around during the Carter years when the environmental movement got a big boost. Carter was very pro-environment. And many of us were quite excited that maybe we actually were going to be able to accomplish something here. And then suddenly a guy
We got a
named
big
Ron,
report, at least Global 2000, right?
that's right. And then, of course, we had a fellow named Ronald Reagan came along, and he took the panels off the roof of the White House. He kind of closed down the environmental movement as best he could. And I realized that these legislative activities and all the progress we had made, very important, but in one administration, you could begin to see this whole thing start being rolled back.
Mm,
Of course, we saw it again with the previous administration in the States.
mm,
So these things can be knocked down very quickly if you get
mm.
people in power that are able to do that. So I realized from those experiences, we need a much stronger cultural, experiential foundation for the environmental movement if it was really going to work. So that people would be coming from a much deeper place where they saw the rest of life and all living beings as like family. And they cared about it. They had that open-hearted love and compassion for the well-being of all living things as a foundational part of their being. And the only way to really, you can get that as a philosophy and think about it, but it's a whole different thing if you get that from the cellular level of your being and you experience that as a fundamental truth. And the most powerful way to do that I'd ever experienced was this wave nature you process that I was sharing with you the other day, where you have the training, you have the depth, diving into the depth of the base of the of source, and then you rise from that with creativity.
Before we come more to the practice, John, that you just indicated, I want to double check on one distinction. You use the distinction between outer nature, inner nature, and true nature. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, of course, outer nature is this amazing, magical world that we all are born into, and this extraordinary display of the elements: earth, air, water, wind, fire, wood, and space. And then, of course, outer nature, in my own case, I explored very deeply through the science of ecology. Biology plays a major role in that too. But it's very different when you explore it through what you're given as your basic fundamental toolkit, which I realized when I began to examine what is the toolkit for examining outer nature. Well, it's sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, the experience of movement and balance, the experience of life force and energy, and then, of course, the display of emotions and thoughts in relationship to those other 7 fields of experience. So I began to develop
So
ways.
our senses are the tools that are given to us.
So those 7 fields, giving the direct experiential information, and then the other 2, emotions and thoughts, which give kind of additional information based on our emotional response and the way we think about what our senses is giving to us. So all together they make up 9 fields of experience. So I call them the 9 experiential fields. And that allows us to really explore experientially outer nature.
Mm.
And then the toolkit actually resides with not just in outer nature, but also within us. We have all of those perceptions and senses and experiential field capacities lie within inner nature. And so inner nature is that vast matrix of capacities to make that connection to the outer nature aspect. And then if you follow the outer nature aspect and the inner nature aspect, and you cultivate them deeply, refine them, then you can also begin to follow them back into where they originate internally within yourself. And that begins to unfold this boundless, formless, vast, spacious, level of pristine, open consciousness and awareness, which appears to be the foundation. According to most of the great spiritual traditions, that's the foundational base of Source itself and the source of pure creativity. So by simply turning the process of always just going out, you turn that process around and go back in through the inner nature aspect and then point it directly back into source. And if you get skilled at that, then when you finally reach the point where the experiential field is touching into the most fundamental part of yourself, that drops you directly into, or has the capacity or the invitation for you to then drop directly into the open, clear awareness aspect of your being. True nature. So that's the third nature. Outer, inner, and true.
What is it that you learn that really helps while this journey from outer nature to inner nature to true nature is something that maybe many of us aspire to progress on? It is, with our everyday awareness, often hard to do. So, what guidance can you give to us where we could, let's say, in a period of 2 to 4 hours or something, kind of maybe half a day, where we could um, maybe explore a different way of connecting with the land, of connecting with Mother Nature? What guidance can you give us that is helping us to progress on that journey from the outer to the inner, from the inner to the true?
Wow, what a beautiful question. I love it. Um, well, the great thing is that we, almost all of us, have some capacity to make a connection to outer nature, even if we live in the middle of a city. And there are gardens, there are parks, there are beautiful trees that we discover. So the first thing is to take a little time to explore. I mean, it could be your backyard even, or perhaps a garden in your home on a terrace. But ideally, you would want to be in contact with Mother Earth. That would be the ideal. And try to find a spot or a place where you can be in relative peace and quiet and solitude, where you're not having a lot of contact with other humans, because you really want to drop out for a little while with that busyness of the outer life. And when you have a lot of other people around, you're constantly being reminded of your previous, the way life normally goes for you. So pay attention to your senses and where you feel you have a potential invitation to go deeper into the connection with the plants, the animals, the elements, the birds, the flowers, all the forms of nature which you love. And once you've found a spot like that, maybe in a little local park or a little patch of woods in your neighborhood, you might have to make a short trip of maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but try not to make it a big deal to get to. It's far better to find your immediate neighborhood that you can access easily. And then the next stage is, once you found that spot, and again, if you make it relatively private, it doesn't have to be perfect, but relatively private at least. Then you go there and you open your heart. You give your thanks back to Mother Earth and to nature and to Great Spirit, however you may envision that, and give thanks for the gift of this experience of being connected to the world of life and spirit. And you begin to, I like to use a simple thing we call the 11 direction ceremony, where you create a field through a very simple universal ceremonial process. You set your intent to connect to the directions and to the Mother Earth and to the heavens and to the essence of yourself. And then through that, it opens up, through the power of intent, it opens up a field effect that then supports the deepening of the experience of that spot as very special and sacred. And a place that you would go to, similar to going to a church or a synagogue or a temple. But this is a temple of the earth. that you've actually benefited you've been participated in helping create through the power of the intent that you bring to that place and the open heart and the good loving energy you bring to that spot. Once you've done those things, then you've established a place where you can go to on a regular basis, maybe a daily basis, ideally, and spend a little time. But when you're doing this for the first time, you may only have an hour or two to spend, or maybe better yet, a whole half day at least, and begin to settle into a very quiet inner space. I've noticed that most of the things that prevent people from making connection with those 9 experiential fields is blockages that arise that have been unattended to in the substrate of our being. Most of them boil down to either contractions or distractions of various kinds. Distractions might be emotional, they might be physical, they might be mental. The same is true for both contractions and distractions actually cause an interruption in the process of connection. So the way to heal that, for one thing, is to open the heart to yourself as well as to this place that you're in nature. And spend a little time doing a deep relaxation exercise. You open and use the power of your intent to open the blockages that you sense within yourself that are preventing authentic connectivity. And if you combine that power of deep relaxation with the profound power of presence, meaning you're not distracted by something about to happen or something that just happened, you're staying right with the moment of what's arising within you as a contraction. And then you go deeper and deeper with the releasing process. I've developed some meditative processes where you very slowly scan through the entire body, releasing, 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 relaxing, 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 presencing in union, because the relaxation and the presence work together as a team. And what that does is unblock all these aspects of your body and your emotions and your mind. And then you're really ready to connect through these 9 experiential fields because they're more open, they're more clear, they're more capable of making authentic connectivity. And of course, that's a lifetime delightful exploration that opens then. And of course, you work within the context of those 3 natures. You become aware that always outer nature, inner nature, and true nature are intimately interconnected. And if you're not familiar with your true nature aspect, which many people are not, because the most obvious thing that holds our life is the awareness and the consciousness of life itself. But it's so obvious that we often forget to pay attention to it. So when you turn the experiential fields around and fall them back into the place of origination, then the senses and the experiential fields begin to point directly into that pure awareness aspect of your true nature. And when you do that, you begin to identify with that as your fundamental being instead of the form of yourself, the ideas of yourself, the names you have, the history you have, your story, and so on. Those are still there, but they're not the main theme. You begin to more and more identify with this core kind of boundless aspect of yourself, which is really birthless and deathless. And and then, of course, it goes the other way too. When you make that connection with this creative essence of yourself, that creativity flows out through the experiential fields and manifests as this amazing display of outer nature. And you really feel connected. So you go through a process of first feeling disconnected because of your contractions. Then you enter a period of being authentically connected, maybe for the first time in your life since a baby. And then you begin to go deeper into that connection until you actually have an experience of being both connected and deeply unified almost, but there's still a separate you. And we call that the stage of communion. If you go deep into that, then you can have unitive experiences where, say, you and a tree or a flower or some being of nature are actually in a state of complete unity. That's a wonderful experience when people begin to have that experience. And then ultimately you can begin to have that with everything within that sacred place that you've established in nature. And we've developed techniques to deepen that process to an absolutely profound level. And we finally reach a point where everything is experienced as kind of a sacred sphere that you're connecting to. Like in the East, they talk about a mandala experience, a sacred wheel or a sacred sphere, because it's going out in all directions. And you begin to feel that everything within your field of perception and experience is arising as a integrated whole system, kind of mandala or medicine wheel. And at that point, if you can follow that back into your true nature, the whole thing emerges a very sacred event and a very sacred space. Now that what I've just described takes a little time to develop that level of connectivity, but it's an extraordinary experience. It can change your life if you return to that repeatedly again and again and again. Your whole life system begins to shift into a very different kind of experience of what life is all about. And because you've made connection with your source aspect, your true nature aspect, it also opens the gates to kind of very pure creativity, which often meets exactly what is appropriate in the moment for you in your normal life flow. From an environmental perspective, because you've made a deep connection to nature through these 9 fields, the kind of creativity that arises from this connection with true nature is often a kind of creativity that expresses itself with perfect insights as to how to bring yourself and the rest of culture back into balance with the rest of life. So it provides a well of creative insight for coming back into harmony and sustainability with the rest of the planet and nature.
Thank you so very much, John, for sharing these profound principles and practices for the way of nature and on the path kind of to connecting to our true deeper sources of knowing and of awareness. I want to, as we close this, I want to go back to the beginning because most of us, I'm certainly including myself here, will be finding themselves as a beginner of that path. So I just want to mention kind of the few things that I heard you saying. So for you to, and then, close with a question on one area that wasn't that clear to me. So you invited us to really be that, some of us are still quarantined, right? So you may not be able, but then kind of you use maybe a plant kind of inside your space, or maybe in your garden if you have access to,
a garden
or a park nearby. So don't make too big a deal of it, but connect to such a place that is attainable for you, you said. And then you guided us kind of through a series of principles. Pay attention to the senses, and everything you shared with us around that. And then the next turn was open your heart and give your things back to Mother Nature, and kind of entering kind of in that deepened field of connection. And then you mentioned kind of the aspect of the ceremonial aspect. So you mentioned kind of setting the intention, and you mentioned as an example for that the 11 direction practice. And then from there you went okay, so when you do that, what happens, right? All the distractions, right? Contractions and distractions are coming up, the blockages. And that one way of dealing with them, so when that comes up, because that's certainly also something I experienced kind of when you guided me through the week-long solo process. And one thing, so your key guidance there was really open your heart, not only to others, not only to Mother Nature, but also to yourself,
Exactly.
and to your own intention. And then you talked about deep relaxation and presence, kind of as the twin principles, kind of that support each other, and that can help us to connect to the deeper state of communion. So, which you then elaborated in pure awareness, which you elaborated on. I want to end with the middle piece of what you said, which is, I think the paying attention to the senses, open your heart to Mother Nature, and really kind of the gratitude, particularly in this moment in time we are in. I think that is quite intuitive for many of us. But then the third one, which is the ceremonial aspect and the 11 direction practice. So setting the intention, what actually does that mean? And how is it that I can so I can work, or I can work with my power of intention in a way that is more almost intentional, you could say.
Yeah, yeah. Great question. Um, I'll try to make it very simple as I can. There's some confusion with people about intention versus will. They're different. Will is mostly coming from a sense of separate self. I want to do this. I will accomplish that. I will do this. I will not do that. And that type of consciousness. Intent is very different. Intent comes from a general feel. It actually ties in somewhat to that sensing thing we talked about before. But you sense being connected to a larger field of existence. And don't worry about whether it's there or not. Just trust that it's happening, just in it, like in a quantum sense. And with that trust, you allow something to arise that is a kind of it's something which is an impulse, which serves both oneself and the entire field, and the forms of that field, the forms of life in nature. And then when that becomes clear, the intent as it becomes formed, as it's birthed really from the continuum of your being, then you place that intention in the field of pure awareness, pure consciousness, or the field of all being. And you place it and you release it into that field. And the most important thing, you completely let go of the result. You completely let go of the result. There's no control, no attempt to control or determine the end result of it. You trust that the entire system is taking care of the details, and that that's a very concise summary of the power of intent and how it comes into being and how it's different than will. Will in general doesn't work very well. It's a bad servant of this kind of process that we've been sharing here today, whereas intent is the absolute core of virtually every aspect of the process, including doing a simple ceremony that you can kind of make up for yourself. The main thing is to have a good heart when you make an offering. I like to use some kind of a substance to offer. I usually here we use tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, copal, and those kinds of things for offerings. But depending on where you live, you might have a different kind of material. Or if you don't have anything with you for that, you can simply place the hand to the heart, feel it being filled with loving energy, and then offer that beautiful loving energy out to nature and as you do the ceremony. And if people are interested in our 11 direction ceremony, they can find that, I think, in the Way of Nature website. We have it listed somewhere there, and we're in some of the books that we have. But basically, if that's too complicated for you in the beginning, you could just do a simple honoring the 4 directions, north, south, east, west, and honoring Mother Earth, honoring Great Spirit and the heavens, and honoring the source essence of being. And and in general, we generally identify we start with the East, and we identify that with creative upwelling and birth. The South, we identify with the opening of the heart and the fulfillment of the life force, where it kind of reaches its optimal level. And the west is the direction like the setting sun and the moon. We see all of the old material that's no longer serving can be released into the westerly direction. So you purify and clear the decks as you face the west and release all the obscurations that no longer are helping support your life or the planet. And then as you turn to the north, because all those blockages have been released, a kind of universal wisdom arises in the north. And that's a very simple sort of way to think about each of the directions. And of course, with the east, that birthing direction, the south, the energy that comes up from the birth of the life force, that also opens the heart. And so that the energy of the opening heart and the energy of the fullness of the life force brings out the blockages and the obscurations in your being, which then can be released in the west. And then when you turn to the north, the wisdom arises naturally because you've released the blockages to the inherent fundamental wisdom that's your birthright. That's actually part of your basic nature, your true nature. But that can be then revealed because much has been released that's blocking that from being recognized. And then you address that in the north. And then you can repeat that several times if you wish, so you can go deeper and deeper like a spiral. But we usually conclude by honoring then Mother Earth and thank her for all that she's done to support us in all of nature and stand to support the world of spirit. I like the Native American term, Great Spirit. It's a beautiful term that is kind of universal. And then honoring that source essence of your own true nature at the very end by turning slowly in a clockwise spiral to complete. And then just standing in a state of openness at the end of the ceremony to feel into the union of inner, outer, and true nature.
Thank you so much, John, for your boundless generosity, sharing this with us. I can attest myself that kind of the journey kind of with your guidance kind of was life-changing for me. And I'm so thankful for you that kind of with this master class you're just giving to us, you offer these teachings for so many more. And for those of us and those of you who want to deepen this journey, sacredpassage.com, kind of that's where that's your website. And that's where also not only the programs you're offering, but also the master students that have been working with you over the years and over the decades kind of are offering these programs in various parts of the world. So sacredpassage.com. And thank you so much, John, for the gift that you're providing to us.
Oh, and by the way, some of those regional groups, we've now transited to using wavenature.com as a main website access. But many of the regional groups, there are groups in Austria, Sweden, Italy, New Zealand, soon Taiwan, and so on.
And you also mentioned Brazil, right? Because we have like people from all these places here in our community.
In Brazil and Mexico as well. So they can look up Way of Nature with the country name of that area and probably connect with the local regional group.
So Way of Nature or sacredpassage.com.
Right.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. It's great to see you again. You look great.
And so our plan is, so if possible, to maybe in one of the upcoming Gaia sessions that we are hosting, to continue this conversation and go a little kind of deeper in some of the aspects that we just touched upon today.
That'd be wonderful.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, John. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.